Hello, and welcome to our video audio podcast, Couched in Color. I'm your mental health expert, teen and young adult crusader, and psychological scientist, Dr. Alfie. This podcast reflects my life's work, helping our young people and young at heart identify mental health challenges, disrupt negative patterns, and discover the best versions of themselves. I'm so happy that you've joined us. For over 20 years, I want you to know that I've had my finger on the pulse of BIPOC teen mental health. I recognize that historically and currently, with these dual pandemics of COVID and racial injustice raging, our young people are suffering, sometimes they're struggling, and always the care that they need is quite scarce. So each week, I'm joined by young people, mental health experts, celebrities, and influencers to help us uncover the secrets to healing the hearts and minds of our BIPOC teens, their families, and their communities. Here at Couched in Color, we believe deeply in spreading love and light, bolstered by culturally relevant science. So let's dive in. So it is my pleasure to be here with my friend, Mr. David Johns. I'm going to allow David to introduce himself and definitely show us what you got going on, because I think it's really important, but
I
seriously,
didn't
for
get
people
that
to see.
redone.
They look fantastic. We'll get to talk a little bit about how we met, how we know each other. He's just a lovely human being and just very much a fierce advocate for the things that he's very passionate about. And so if you don't mind, my friend, please introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about you and the work that you're passionate about.
I should be able to do that. Thank you for making space for me, friend. My name is David Johns. Professionally, as my friend Julie would say, on my mixtape, I am the quarterback of the National Black Justice Coalition. We're the nation's only civil rights organization that is both intentional and unapologetic and standing at the intersections of racial equity and LGBTQIA plus equality. I use the term same gender loving, not gay. We can come back to that. And so much of our work is acknowledging that as long as Black people have existed, we've existed in incredibly beautiful diversity. Even before the terms lesbian and gay existed, the author Some says that the word gatekeeper existed in her village on the continent of Africa. And so our work is about shining the light on the parts of our community that are too often neglected and ignored. On the B side, the remix of my mixtape, I am a puppy parent. I have a pandemic puppy named Baldwin. I am a brother to Melinda and uncle to Jordan and to now 1-year-old twin boys, Jax and Jet. People call me passionate when they're big nice because I leverage my privilege to be disruptive, and so much of my work is anchored by being an educator. I taught kindergarten, third grade, as well as college. I led a White House initiative on educational excellence for African Americans for still my president, Barack Hussein Obama. And so my first lady, Michelle Yvonne Robinson Obama, who's among the smartest people I've ever had the chance to encounter. And I'm now also completing a PhD. I am at this point done with my coursework. I'm all but dissertation. I'm a sociologist in the spirit of Du Bois and Asa Hilliard. I study how race works in schools. I spend a lot of time thinking about race and racism and how it affects and constrains life, outcomes, and opportunities for Black folks generally, and specifically for Black children and youth in particular, because they have to deal with the problems we created and did not ask to be born or extend an invitation to do so.
Oh, that's wonderful. There's so much there to unpack. And it, as I said, it really is a pleasure to have you here. So I think to dive in around, well, let me just say, I do deeply appreciate how, as you describe it, or as you describe your friends describe it, the passion that you bring to this work. And being unapologetic about who you are and unapologetic about who you fight for and who you advocate for. When we met, I think we initially met, I knew who you were because I followed you on Twitter years ago. This is when, like you said, our president, the only one, right, and our first lady, the only one. Look, and my only congresswoman is two. Bonnie Watson Coleman, and Auntie Maxine, honey. I love me some Maxine.
Listen.
Oh my gosh, like fangirl.
But
Like I met her one.
there's so many leaders within the Black Caucus, though. We can talk about more about them
That's
later.
true.
Yeah,
There are a ton of them. I'm the ones that I'm surfacing are the ones where I just look at them and I like just start to weep because they're
that
just
makes
like,
sense. I get
ooh.
that.
So, and Maxine been out there fighting for a million years. She's just like, she proud to the people and she don't care. Reclaiming my time. Like I have a pen of her. Like I'm just such a fangirl of her. So anyway, but through our work together as part of the Congressional Black Caucus Emergency Task Force for Black Youth Suicide Prevention and Mental Health, what I really loved about what you brought to it is really forcing us, all of us who are a part of that group, to really think about all of us under the umbrella of Black, right? That's a lot, right? And we want to make sure that we're creating space and holding space and really trying to address the mental health needs of our young people. I won't say regardless, but inclusive of all of who they are. So I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, like one thing that sticks out in my mind is when you organized and brought the young people to speak at the briefing. And those were some, like just thinking, ooh, those stories were just so powerful and so moving. So can you talk a little bit about your interest in this work around young people's mental health, around same gender loving young people's mental health, transgender, some people say queer, young people's mental health, and why that's important to you for our Black young people?
Yeah, happy to do so. I think in threes. So let me say one that words matter. There's power and precision. I appreciate the care with which you employ them. And for folks who have questions about any of the terms that have or will be used, there's a terminology guide that you can find at mbjc.org. If you look under resources, it's the last thing on the drop-down menu. It'll explain every term that we've used, and if not, you can DM us at mbjc on the move, and we're happy to explain it. So when we talk about our community, we use three terms with the hope of being as inclusive as possible: trans, queer, and non-binary. And in that context, right, to be clear, ontologically, the word queer references any group or person or people who are not in power. So in the context of white America, Black people are queer.
Okay.
However, as applied over time, that idea has, and the term has become used colloquially to refer to people's um, uh, who have minority identities with regard to sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression.
That's right.
And because there's power and precision, and we acknowledge that transness is an identity, it's not
Mm-hmm.
a sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
There's also need for precision. And so those are three terms that we use. I hope that was helpful to some. As it relates to young people, my interest in young people and really in again power and precision. When I said that term, what I thought about is that when I taught kindergarten, there were so many people who were preoccupied with my maleness,
Mm-hmm.
my gender as having as my cisgender, right? So I'm a cisgender male, a doctor
Mm-hmm.
assigned maleness to me at birth, and I identify and agree with that assignment.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes me a cisgendered male. But because the field of education and supporting formally the learning and development of children, especially young children, has been feminized over time, people were so concerned with my male body in that space, right? Then there's, the physical dynamic. I'm over 6'5".
Mm-hmm.
I'm a Black man. I tend to suck up oxygen when I walk into a room based on my
Mm-hmm.
presence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm mindful of I'm mindful of the term, and so I want to be clear that my interest in advocating for young children is a calling, right? I like many of my friends who are educators, accept that God has purpose for me to be an educator. I believe educators do God's work, and for me, it was a reluctant journey. And there are two things that were really important for me to learn while being enrolled in the process of helping young people figure out who they are in the world around them. And one is that too often adults forget what it was like to be young. And in particular, we forget that young people are experts in their own lived experience. Uh, uh, and too often, adults seek to solve problems for them without ever asking them what's wrong. The question is usually, what's wrong with you?
Mm-hmm.
We don't ask what's wrong, and we don't listen seeking to
Mm-hmm.
learn. We listen to respond.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the White House, still my White House under Barack Hussein Obama and Michelle Obama Robinson Obama, we created this thing called AFAM Ed Summits, where the one rule at these community forums at colleges and universities and schools throughout the country is that the only experts who got to speak were students.
Oh.
Students as young as kindergarten all the way through college, traditional and non-traditional. And we allowed them to answer questions to develop a policy agenda that would also inform praxis, the place where policy meets practice. We would start by asking them what's the best thing about being young, gifted, Black, and whatever other intersectional identities they would hold. And then we would seek to identify what solutions existed for the adults in that space to be enrolled in the process of solving the problems that they identified matter to them. And so that is something that guides me in the way that I sort of show up and leverage my privilege and the invitations that I receive based on the things that I've been able to accomplish as a result of the sacrifices that people have made before me, to connect those dots for adults so that they can listen to young people. The last thing is what I also know based on my experience. I spent 10 years crafting federal policy on Capitol Hill. I took a pay cut from teaching elementary school to move to DC to be a fellow with the Congressional Black Caucus. And I spent the bulk of my time as a senior policy advisor on the Committee for Health, Education, Labor, and Pension, which sees more than 40% of legislation introduced in any given Congress. And what I saw as for 8 of 10 years, I was the only Black man as a staffer. There was not a single, there were 2 Black male senators, Senator Obama, Senator Booker, neither of whom, let me make sure that I mark this, Senator Obama might have been on the Health Committee at one point early on. But suffice it to say that there were not very many of us, and people who were making decisions that affect us in intimate ways in health care, education, employment, workforce development, lots of other areas of policy. I had no meaningful attachment, right? And what I saw there in particular with regard to young folks is that data, the data that affirms white supremacy, what Black feminists refer to as the Matrix of Domination, the sign systems and symbols that allow whiteness and white supremacy to be omnipresent and always invisible, includes data. And right now, there's not a federal data set, whether it's in education, employment, healthcare, name an agency, that allows for my full self to be counted. And so what that means is that when we have conversations about the experiences of students, and we do so through federal data sets like ECLSK or NCLS, right? Like these data sets that major research institutions and think tanks all pull from, critical parts of our young people and their experiences are erased. And so what I know based on the data that we've collected, both qualitative and quantitative, is that students who are not only Black, but Black and LGBTQIA+, who have a disability, whose parents are not Native, who experience housing insecurities, who have relationships with the prison industrial complex, have more challenging experiences in schools. And that also extends to the mental health trauma that they experience, the violence, the bullying, the harassment, the being pushed out of schools, the being pulled into prisons. Like all of that is often erased and it's flattened. And so conversations about Black students assume that they are heterosexual, heteronormative, and conversations about queer students assume that they're all white. And so I'm thankful for Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman for allowing us space at the beginning of this process of talking about the mental health challenges that Black young people face, to be able to acknowledge that Black young people are also queer, trans, and non-binary.
That's right.
And that they in particular face, as they articulated for themselves, right? I'm proud, I think a lot about them now, and Justin still serves as a member of NBJC's Youth and Young Adult Advisory Council, but their ability to articulate for themselves, not only the challenges they face, but the ways that they're working to overcome them, will always, for me, be paramount whenever anyone in a position of power, whether it's elected or appointed or taken, has the ability to do something on behalf of children and youth and or populations of people that are most often impacted by decisions that people make, but least likely to be invited to the decision-making tables themselves.
That is so powerful, especially the part about, there's this old saying, I think it comes out of the rehabilitation community, nothing about us without us. And I think what you just articulated really does surface that particular point about we are quick to, it's 2 things that I really one thing I'm so passionate about, and I'm so glad I have you here because I really just want to hear you speak on it because I get riled up about it. And I feel like sometimes I'm not enough of an authority in this space to be able to say it. So I'm going to hold on to that one. That one's real easy. But this other piece of why we adults have such a hard time asking young people what they need and then giving them the space to answer the question. I struggle with that. I don't understand why it is so difficult for us to sit down
Oh,
and
you
listen to the
shouldn't.
young people.
You shouldn't. What I have found is that it is difficult because adults don't want to be held accountable for our failures.
Mm,
And so it is much easier to try, and I'll do it this way. One
yes.
of the summits that I'll never forget, we were in Nevada,
Okay.
University, UNLV,
Okay.
and the young people were asked to get in small groups and work together and talk about and identify this policy agenda. And then representatives from each of these small groups stood in front of this room that included state and local school board representatives, educators, teachers, leaders, elected officials, the like. And my rule is when the young people speak, then you just listen. The adults don't
That's
get to
it.
say a single thing.
That's right.
And so there was a beautiful, brilliant young woman who got up and who essentially said that it is a travesty that adults in positions of power, especially in schools, do not care about children unless they are super accelerating or they are super struggling.
Mm-hmm.
And she talked about the importance of so many students who were in the middle who don't get the
Yep.
attention that they deserve. And
Yep.
one of the representatives from the school board could not wait to stand up and tell this baby all of the work that she had done to try and address her problem. And you could watch the energy, the excitement, the spirit of what this young person was saying, like leave her body as this adult clearly didn't listen to
Yep.
learn. She listened to
Yep.
respond. And so
Yep.
I leveraged my privilege in that space to be disruptive, to invite this woman to have a seat or to leave. I acknowledged this moment for what it was and talked about what we all saw and named it,
Mm,
and invited this young person to say exactly what she needed to say and the way in which she needed to say it.
mm.
And for me, it wasn't I understood that for every adult in that space, I feel implicated in that regard.
Yes,
Like
of course.
we work to ensure that they don't have to, at least in the way that I've learned as an African descendant, we
Yes.
work to ensure that our babies have it better than we did.
Yes.
And so the idea that like they're still dealing with the same shit, excuse the right, but
Yeah,
like
no, you're fine.
the same shit that like that has existed for a lot longer than I've been alive is like that's on us. And it's just
Yep.
difficult and uncomfortable for us to be held accountable to that, to be called on it, first of all, to be held accountable for it. And so it's much easier to just say to them, like, well, it's better. You now have it better than I did.
Yes.
And let me tell you all of the ways. And
Yes.
so some of it for me is that like we don't really have spaces to heal
Nope.
from the trauma that we are still exposed to,
Nope.
that is exacerbated, especially in moments like now where there are so many different crises that are affecting us emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, financially, and otherwise. We don't often have literally the language
Yes.
to engage in stigma-free, asset-based conversations
Yes.
about all of these things, right?
Yes. Yes.
And I also think more recently, when I celebrate some of the more recent wins, we also don't have windows and mirrors. We don't have podcasts or shows like Pose or writers like Elin Harris to or Michael Arsenault or Darnell Moore or Brittany
Yep.
Cooper, right? Like, or
Yep.
people who allow us to understand that the master narrative that has been constructed by colonialism and that's affirmed by white supremacy and that's contributed to by heteronormative ways of thinking about performing blackness,
Mm-hmm.
or designed as tools to oppress us. And
Mm.
so whenever people talk about kids or whenever people talk about young people, for me, it's important that young people are able to talk for themselves. And whenever
Yes.
young people are centered, for me, it's important that people hold space for the fullness of their diversity. I
Oh,
hope that answered your question.
no, totally. Totally. It did. And I think what I struggle with, not a little less so since you shared this with me and surfaced it in the way that you did, is why there's some of us who get it and who can be quiet and listen. I heard exactly what you said, why others of us don't. And I wish there were an easier way for us to communicate. This is some of the work that I do in terms of my research. It's literally teaching parents or raising their awareness about how and why it is important to ask your child to speak with you and then just to be quiet. Like literally, we have a protocol that we developed as part of my research lab that teaches parents how to communicate with teenagers and with kids.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, I'm from the South, and so children were seen and not heard. And my parents were
Mm-hmm.
wonderful, right? My parents are pretty progressive, and I've shared many times with people, my mom's deceased. She was less so progressive than my father, but my father's response to, how he's a civil rights person from the civil rights movement. So when he was a kid, and they from Mississippi, it really was about do what I ask you to do. Don't question me. Get over there and sit down and be quiet. And he just railed against that. So he joined the Navy as a very young man, went around the world, met all different kinds of people, right? And we're talking like late 60s. So by the time my brother and I came along, he was like, we're not doing that. If you have emotions, you express your emotions. If you need to raise your voice a little bit, like don't get crazy with it, but if you want to raise your voice a little bit because you're emotional, why would I tell you not to do that? So I had both of those. And I think that's a
Yeah.
part of why it was difficult for me to understand. That was always about being respect, because we still Black, right? You still got to be
Yeah.
respectful. Don't be coming out your mouth, also. And my mama had a thing where she
Sideways,
was,
right?
right? Yeah, don't be coming out your mouth sideways. And she had a thing where she was like, don't look at me in that tone of voice. And so you just have to kind of, right? So mama won't play. She was a traditional Black mom. But I know that
Understood.
part of my upbringing, because it was that way, I think it's a little bit easier for me to be quiet, and just to sort of take in what young people are saying. So I hope that many people who are watching us will hear you say exactly what you said about don't listen to respond. Listen to just take in what the young person's saying. Just take it
Yes,
in.
yes, and not just young people. I got chills when I thought about this. One of the things that I struggle with as a grown ass man is that one of the consequences of my maleness is that, and my Black maleness is that I am expected to not emote.
Yep,
I'm expected to not have emotions, and
that's
if I
right.
do have them, I'm not supposed to respond in ways that acknowledge that I have them.
That's
And
right.
so I really struggle mightily with being tone policed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I thought about that when you talked about your mom, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
like, don't look at me in that tone of voice.
Mm-hmm.
And your dad's acknowledgement that like when you feel something, for some of us, it is expressed in voice modulation. And
That's right.
my friends and I joke. We talked earlier about Angela, my twin. Angela often jokes that like I can't whisper, I have no inside voice, and she's right, right? Like, and so what that means is that when I'm impassioned about something, when I'm arguing a particular point that I feel
Yes.
righteous about,
Yes.
you hear it in my voice. It is both a
Yes.
blessing and a curse. It is a
Yes.
curse because in conversations with people who hide behind tone,
Yes.
and who don't want to deal with topics that are emotional, right? Like the loss of
Yes.
Black lives, the trauma that kids endure, right? Like these things should engender emotions. And
Yes.
often what I find is that people don't want to deal with that or the content of what I'm saying. And so the response is to then want to talk about my tone. And I'm real
Yes.
quick to tell somebody now, like, I'm not the one to be tone police. And I'm also not the one to allow you to use that as a tool to get away from the core of what I'm saying.
That's
And
right.
really long way of inviting everyone to be mindful of the ways that language and tools like tone policing or erasing the voices of young people. Shit, I get mad and I think about when I was at TFA conferences and they would celebrate like the value of student voice and then render them invisible and irrelevant because they then like read a letter from a student, right? Like there are just these habits that have become ingrained in us that too often we don't ask why we do them, that
Mm-hmm.
have these significant consequences, and I want us to do better.
Oh, me too. Me too. So you gave me a perfect segue to this last little piece that I want to talk about. And this is something that I can feel I don't know if it's anger, I don't know if it's rage, I don't know what it is, not a positive feeling that I have about the ways in which we create these boxes and this dichotomy as it relates
Mhm.
to, as you shared, LGBTQIA, same gender loving young people, queer young people. You either are Black and that part of your identity nobody wants to talk about, or
Mhm.
you're LGBTQIA and you can't be Black. And that I cannot imagine. I'm always thinking about how challenging this must be for our young people. So I'm not going to call nobody's organization out. I'm not going to do it. But I find myself frequently when I'm in these conversations in different settings, having this argument about, okay, we're talking about same gender loving young people, queer, LGBTQIA, but I don't see no brown nowhere up in here. And I see data, and I know they're not talking about kids of color. And I'm thinking, like, how I understand how they don't get it. So it's sort of like a rhetorical question. But like, how can you advocate and for lack of a better term, sort of, I ain't gonna say that because that's bad. I was gonna say split the baby, but we don't want to say that. But make our young people split, like how I just can't stand that. So I'm just curious about your thoughts. You
Yeah.
mentioned that a little earlier. I'm just curious your
Yeah.
thoughts about that and how that impacts our young people. And I'm not gonna let us off the hook. Because I know for us as Black folk, right? We all lives matter, but we don't want to talk about trans lives. We don't want to talk about
Yeah.
LGBTQIA, right? We don't want to talk about that. So I'm
Yeah.
not letting us off the hook either. But I'm just really curious about your thoughts about that. And if you can tell us what are things that we can do to do better.
Yep. I'm taking notes
Okay.
because that's a lot. So a few things. One is hearing your articulation of the challenges that people have understanding and operationalizing intersectionality,
Yes.
which, to be clear in this moment, is a term that was popularized by Kimberly Crenshaw,
Yes, sir.
who has done groundbreaking work in critical race theory. She's responsible for introducing the term into the legal canon, into the academy,
That's right.
which is why it's become one of the things that now people talk about, and that this current administration is attacking for that very reason.
That's exactly right.
And the term has also been written about by Patricia Hill Collins, who reminds
Yes.
us that indigenous people
Yes.
throughout the diaspora, in particular Latin America, used intersectionality as a way to think about the multiple marginalized experiences that some of us have, in particular when engaging with systems or institutions.
Yes.
And so that is important to think about because
Yes.
people are now using the term intersectionality with no understanding
No
of what it means,
context.
where it came
They
from, or how it should be applied.
That's it. They sound woke. They use it so they can sound woke, right?
Jesus.
Intersection and look,
And they
when people
sound
really
hella ignorant.
yes, and it's intersectionality almost always when I hear it. I'm gonna call my sisters out, but it's always in the context of women, right? So women of different races. There's one group of
Yeah.
women who always talk about intersect, and I'm like, wait, you're like really missing all of the. It's like
Well, that's
way
because
more to
white
this.
women exploit terms primarily to benefit them, right? Like Derek Bell, another critical race theorist, talks about interest convergence. And we should all remember that there's not been a single piece of federal legislation that has been passed that has not benefited white people, in particular white women, who are tools of upholding white supremacy. We should all be clear. Without them having been privileged. You can read more about affirmative action to that point. So the point around affirmative action, I think, is important, foundational.
Yes.
The second thing is often, for a number of reasons that I'll get into, Freeman Hrabowski, the president of UMBC, often says this, that we should be not beholden to the tyranny of either or,
That's
but
it.
be liberated by the beauty of both and.
Amen.
And too often, because there's this illusion of constrained choice or limited resources, there is the burden of time and trauma and the things that people are responsible for navigating on a daily basis on any given day. There are compounded challenges as a result of the failures of elected and appointed and community leaders at every level. All of these things make it difficult for people to do the work of thinking about multiple things at the same time. And a part of what we all have to grapple with is that the flattening of race, the way that, again, white supremacy works, is that when people talk about race, we still even talk about black, white, not acknowledging that there are different machinations therein. There are Afro-Latinx and Afro-Cuban people, and there always have been, right? And so
That's right.
we still default to this myopic, overblown, a very superficial way of thinking,
Yep.
or imagining that black people exist, right?
Right.
All from major metropolitan spaces, all don't know their daddies, right? Like all mamas are welfare queens, like all of these things that
Speak
there
on
are
it.
elements of that are true and that are
Right.
are reflected back in things that we sometimes enjoy, e.g. Tyler Perry plays, right? Not the TV stuff, that's a whole nother
Right.
conversation, but the plays earlier on,
Right. Right.
right? But that also don't represent or reflect the totality of the diversity of our
Not even
experience.
close. That's right.
And so those of us who have the capacity,
Yes.
hold space for other members of our community in particular. I
That's
care
right.
most about Black folks. So I want to talk about us first, and then we can talk about our progressive friends later. We have to hold space for Black folks to remind them that, like, we all hold intersectionality in our being. Most Black folks have a disability.
That's
We have
right.
either been born with one or have been made to have one as a result of white
Mm,
supremacy and toxic stress and poverty,
mm.
right? Like, and we don't even get the luxury of thinking about that, right? Black women, those of us who engage in, and this goes back to where we started. I know so many Black people who have queer, intimate, and romantic relationships who will never identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, pansexual, ace, whatever,
Right.
because those are political categories. I don't
Yes.
use gay because gay
Yes.
is a white male political identifier. The things that are
Ah.
important to the gay agenda, which
Yes.
is informed by primarily white gay men,
Yes.
are not the things that matter to me as a Black man
Right.
or as a Black male feminist.
That's right.
And so I use the term same gender loving, one, because when people think gay, they also think sex, and that's not what
Yes.
this is about, right? Like,
That's right.
so same gender loving centers love. And it
Yes.
also draws from connectedness to my African
Ah.
ness, my African way of being, my African ancestry. It was created by a Black man
Mm.
named Cleo Manawa, who's also from Inglewood, California, which is where I'm from. And so I say that to acknowledge that there are Black folks who engage in intersectional ways of being without
Yes.
having to name it, and sometimes without having to know it. And it's important for us when we can to
Yes.
remind folks of that and to connect these dots. That's why I mentioned Some Bufu, right? Like, there's so
Yes.
many folks who think that, like, those of us who are Black and queer, trans, and non-binary are performing whiteness. That this
Mm.
is some sort of perversion of Africanness. That,
Mm.
and it's the exact opposite, right? Like, I tell folks, if you truly are Hotep in the way that, like, the meaning of the
Yes.
Egyptian word means, right? That means that to be at peace, to have the
Yes.
kind of peace and understanding that acknowledges that as long as we've existed, we've always existed
That's
in
right.
these ways, even before terms that are
That's
tools
right.
to oppress
That's
have
right.
existed. And so all of this to say that Black folks can give each other grace.
Yes.
We can hold each other accountable for the moments when we practice the very same harms against other members of our community that we would impugn white
Yes.
folks and non-Black folks for doing. In particular, I'm
That's
talking
right.
about the disproportionate rate at which Black trans women, Black femme-identified folks, Black non-binary folks are murdered. When people say the names of Black men reflexively, like George Floyd or Ahmaud
Right.
Arbery, and
Right.
we should also learn to say the names of folks like Tony McDade, the
That's
Black
right.
trans man who was murdered the same week as George Floyd in Tallahassee by the police department there.
Mm.
So we can and should do the things that we have come to expect for cis-het Black men and cis-het Black women thereafter. And we should do those things in ways that are equitable. They still need to arrest the men who killed Breonna
Breonna
Taylor to
Taylor,
that
come
point.
on now. Come on.
And we should make space for the trans, queer, non-binary members of our community who often live on the front lines and in the trenches to make all this stuff possible. The
Mm.
conversation about the responsibility for progressive white folks is
Mm.
different slightly. It's different
Mm-hmm.
slightly because often progressive or well-meaning white people are the problem. They're not a
Mm.
part of the problem, they are the problem.
Mm.
And they are the problem because they benefit from white supremacy and from their proximity to white supremacy.
Mm.
For the people who don't understand the point that I'm trying to make in this moment, you should all be clear that, like, white folks have the benefit of living in America where they get to draw privilege from being white, and then they get to come out and move to neighborhoods like Hollywood, California, or Chelsea, New York, or Boys Town, Chicago, and join communities and
Mm-hmm.
associations where they also get to draw strength
Mm-hmm.
from the gay parts of their identity.
Mm-hmm.
Black folks don't have the same luxuries. Most Black,
No.
queer, trans, and non-binary people live with other Black people. We're
Mm-hmm.
disproportionately concentrated in the South. in states where it's still legal to discriminate against us and deny us access to public accommodations. This is after the Supreme Court just this summer in June passed a decision in a case that makes it illegal to deny us access to employment or to fire us, but you got to get the job first before you're fired. So the point I'm making here is that white folks in positions of power and influence don't often uh, are not often held accountable for the ways in which they affirm the very barriers that make it difficult for us to have the conversation that we've just had about intersectionality. And the three things that they can do are to one, get out of the damn way. Too often, folks in positions of power who are not mindful of the needs of our diverse community, the best thing that they can do is to move, like literally move, have a seat, rest,
Chill
just
out.
move.
Yes.
The second thing that folks can do is seek to support while doing no harm. So I get annoyed, to say the least, when folks trip over themselves to demand labor of those of us who do this work in the name of trying to learn or do better.
And don't forget the free part,
Folks
because
have,
it ain't paid labor. It's free labor. And they get mad when you don't. I just was tweeting about that. They get mad when you don't want to do the free labor. And we as Black people,
I don't care. Let them be mad.
We get penalized. We get penalized for not doing the free labor. But go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I had to say that part.
Mad. No, don't be sorry. Let them be mad, which is also why I tell folks I don't believe in employee resource groups. Right? Like what you should ask for is a check to do the work that you're otherwise now doing for free.
Right.
And beyond that, like the CEOs and the C-suite leaders should be held accountable for implementing the things that they're going to affirm that you do now in this additional job that you're not getting credit for. So all of this is a way for us to, again, affirm that people in positions of privilege based on their proximity to whiteness, and we should be clear, like in America, the thing that most people covet, the most valuable property, is whiteness. Those folks can find ways to give their resources, their time, talent, and their treasures in ways that don't do harm.
Yes.
So whether that is, we have a partnership as an organization with Sephora and do a lot of work around their training and cultural competence work. We also benefit from being able to talk about, as we're doing now, the work on their digital platforms. They are a multinational corporation that has millions of followers. We have a relationship this June that resulted in a significant financial investment in the work that we do, right? I offer this as a way to, one, acknowledge this partnership that we have with Sephora that existed before this summer, where there was a significant loss of Black lives that compelled a lot of folks, in particular, including corporations, to get engaged or to put some dollars in the streets, again, which is often a problem. When Black people die, then there's this reflexive response, which doesn't have to be the case. But it's also to say that there are examples for how individuals and organizations who really purport to care about whether or not Black lives matter, to demonstrate it.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Well, this has been so, I mean, it's just really fed me, because what the word that comes to mind is unapologetic. To just say it, right? I really do think, I tell people all the time, sometimes our presence is an act of resistance. And I do think sometimes we liberate others when we show up as liberated people. And that's what you do every time I'm with you. You just show up as liberated. And you said, take up space, take up oxygen. I wouldn't call it taking up. I won't do my little reframe. I'm going to say you just show up as who you are, in the fullness of who you are. Right?
I received that.
Yes. And the fullness of who you are. Like you said, if they get mad, don't nobody care about you being mad. Right? If you show up in your fullness and people have a hard time with that, we don't care. Right? Like, what you really need to do is go get you some. You come and be in the fullness of who you are, and we can be full together. You know what I'm saying? To paraphrase my fellow Howard I Diddy. But, you know, like, just the fullness. And so that's one, I know we're not going to go there, but he's still my fellow Howard I. So I got to big up Howard, especially if things go the way they need to go.
Woo, yes, but we can big up HU based on Kamala Harris. We don't have to do it based on him.
There you go.
Other problematic Black men who are in positions of authority.
Right? Going to lead us. We ain't even going to go there. I've been having that argument with some relatives.
Rappers are not leaders. We should all be clear. Rappers are not leaders. Entertainers are not leaders. They are entertainers. There are ways that they can be helpful in advocacy, but we should be clear about the fact that there are different needs and there are different ways in which we can all show up in the arena.
Yes, yes, yes. I just keep coming back to that interview with Malcolm X, right? That one little clip where he was like just breaking it down. Like, why is that for us? This is who people tell us are our leaders. Like, we are fully capable
Yeah.
of choosing people with the knowledge and the skill and the expertise, just as you shared about your own experience, to lead. And that's who we really want to follow. So again, I just want to honor you for what you brought to this conversation. It's been just such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I wonder if you have any final thoughts. I'll say this, let me prime the pump a little bit for any of our young Black people and young people of color who might be feeling some kind of way or struggling with or experiencing life in a way that's making them feel like who they are as intersectional, queer, same gender loving, right? Young people is not being valued and they're not being seen and heard for, again, the fullness of who they are. What would you like to say to some of those young people?
I would say to my babies, our babies, that you are beautiful and wonderfully made. And I pray that you find the tools required to thrive in spaces where you were forced to survive, until you can find the community that will love the most important parts of who you are. We do a lot of work at NBJC around this concept of thriving. We have those summits I mentioned in terms of the White House FMS summits have been redesigned and are now thriving summits. And so much of what we try and do is remind young folks that they're not crazy, that it's the people and the problems and the systems
That's
around
it.
them.
That's it.
The water that they have been forced to swim in is toxic. They are
That's
not
it.
toxic.
Oof.
There's no such thing as a problem child, right? Like, and the most acute among them, the ones who are able to identify that, like, this don't feel right. Like, y'all lying to us. Like, Christopher Columbus ain't discovered shit, so
If it
why
was
we
already
believe anything
people
coming out of
here.
your mouth, right? Like, it's just so you done lost me now, right? Like,
Right.
those babies are the ones that I want to love on and hug on the most, because the world is designed to break them, and to
Yes.
tell them that they are crazy,
Mm.
and to dismiss them and the ways that they are asking questions. And so I want them to know that there are organizations like the National Black Justice Coalition that exist to support and affirm them. There are places where they can draw power, and if they don't exist in the way that they need, then the tools exist for them to be able to create
Yes.
them for themselves, right? Like, I, yeah, I hope that that will reach whoever it needs to, and I hope that we all consider the opportunities we have to communicate similar messages. You asked earlier about
Yes.
my nails. I'll
Beautiful.
share. They need to be fixed because I've been
They
moving.
look
But
great though.
thank you. So the story behind my nails is has it been a year? I had a mentee who is in elementary school who wanted to paint his nails,
Yes.
and he was concerned about being bullied.
Yes.
And I think the conversation when something like him acknowledging that girls have a whole lot of fun,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm always like, why should girls have all of the fun? But that girls have a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot of fun. I think he acknowledged someone's manicure that was really nice. And then before he could even allow himself to sit in the fullness of that realization and joy and possibility of it, he then dismissed it and said, like, but no, I can't do that because that's not for boys. And so our conversation was like, so what does that mean? What's for girls? What's for boys? Like, nail
Right.
polish is nail polish. Like, it has become
Right.
these things over time. And if you want it, you should have it.
Yes.
And I realized that if I did nothing beyond use my 6'5" grown ass man, I dare you to say something privileged,
Right. Right. Right.
to be disruptive in ways that, like, I smile now, especially when Black men like compliment me or ask me about my nails, in part because for me it's a small way of chipping at these
That's it.
expectations that people
That's
have,
it.
or ways that people police people's bodies or ways of
That's
being,
it.
right? Like, my communication of how I feel, my love for Basquiat, the way that I think about life in chess and being strategic, the way that I still try and lead with love, even if things are complicated, my investment in Black power, right? Like, all of these things are much more about how I think about the world and show up in it than they are about my sexual identity
Mm-hmm.
or who I love.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want us to get beyond the superficial shit, because that's often what becomes suffocating, or otherwise prevents people from literally being able to live.
That's right.
To go back to the core of where we started in our work around suicide reduction. And I think that when more of us commit to doing things like this, both big and small, then we can shift the energy and focus on problems that are much larger and seemingly more intractable.
Yes. Yes. Oh, so beautifully said. I'm not going to summarize or anything. The last thing I'm going to ask you to do is tell people where they can follow you and where they can find more information. I know you shared with us at the beginning about the website and where people can learn terminology.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just
But
where
if
can
people are
people
still
find you?
rocking with us after all this time, listening to me run my mouth, as my mama would say. What's funny about that, right? When I was in elementary school, I used to get unsatisfactories. I got really good grades, but I got unsatisfactories because I would talk, and now I tell them all the time I get paid to run my mouth.
That,
But you can
that's
follow
it.
the work of NBJC at NBJC, the National Black Justice Coalition, on the move, across digital platforms. We're nbjc.org, and I am at Mr. David Johns, Mr. David Johns.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, my love. It has been a pleasure to talk with you. You know, I'm continuing to watch you from afar and just watch that star just keep rising and rising and rising. It's already up there, but it's keep going. And I just really appreciate who you are, what you bring to your work. And as I've said a couple times, that you show up in the fullness of who you are unapologetically. That is so beautiful. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, friend. I appreciate you in the ways that you show up as an accomplice in the work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. So there you have it. That's a wrap for another episode of Couched in Color. We want you to know that we deeply value you, all of our viewers and our listeners, and everyone out there working to support optimal mental health, both for themselves and for our young people. And one of the best ways you can help our movement is by leaving us a 5-star review on our YouTube channel and everywhere you enjoy your audio podcasts, and by sharing our podcast with a friend. Please also tag us while you're out there listening and watching. Finally, head on over to dralfie.com for more information about me, www.acomaproject.org for information about my nonprofit, and those are the places you can go to learn more about how you can help. So I'll see you next week. And until then, I'm going to say what I always say, which is that I'm wishing you lots of love, lots of light, and that I'm hoping it is always, always informed by good, culturally relevant science. Take care.